On October 15, 2008, a tragic incident was recorded in the protocol, a report typical for such documents. Accident. The lines were short, and the meaning seemed clear. 14-year-old Anya Kowalska died during training. The cause, a fall from a diving platform, a blow to the head against the platform, attempts at resuscitation. And that was all. The version presented at the time left no questions. Anya was a good athlete, and this incident shocked not only her family, but also the entire sports community. In the first few days, when the grief was fresh, Coach Jacek Nowak, on whom the responsibility for the incident fell, gave his testimony. According to him, everything happened quickly. She slipped, hit her head, and fell into the water. He, like a true professional, pulled her out, tried to revive her. The story seemed honest, tragic, but quite ordinary. The coach, in essence, became the hero of this situation. But soon, when the forensic investigation was completed, the version presented by the coach came into question. In addition to the head injury, strange bruises were found on Anya's forearms. Experts immediately became interested in this. The hematomas, their shape and location, looked like traces of a strong grip. Such injuries could not have resulted from a fall from a height. This was clearly something else. The coach claimed that everything happened accidentally, and his testimony sounded convincing, but the examination cast doubt on everything he said. The marks on her forearms were clearly not what one would expect from an ordinary fall. Something more was hidden behind this case. The investigation, which began as a routine check of an accident, soon took a completely different turn. The data that seemed to be just additional facts began to form a completely different picture, in which the coach's version and what actually happened diverged greatly. Anya Kowalska was not just one of the athletes on the Polish diving team. She was a symbol of success, hope, and the ambitions of her generation. Her achievements in competitions, her victories in national championships, all of this gave reason to believe that she was on her way to great heights. A member of the Polish junior national team, winner of gold medals at several major tournaments, her career was just beginning, but was already shining brightly. Anya was the face of the sport that everyone aspired to, the image of the ideal athlete ready to become a champion. She was an example for young people. She inspired and showed that success in sports is possible with effort. All of this could not have become a reality without her coach, Jacek Nowak. When speaking of him, one term immediately came to mind: harshness. He was a man who demanded from his charges not just discipline, but complete dedication. Sharp, uncompromising, demanding. He spared no one, and only those who could withstand his methods became true athletes. Nowak was not an example of softness. On the contrary, he became the embodiment of rigorous standards. His own career as an athlete was cut short by an injury, and perhaps this was the catalyst for his approach to training. Unfulfilled ambitions, the desire to push everyone to their limits, to be among the best, all of this he transferred to his students. In the end, his system worked. Under his guidance, champions emerged, winning medals at the biggest tournaments. For Nowak, the main thing was not how much effort an athlete put into training, but how ready they were to go through anything to achieve their goal. Champions are not born in comfort, he believed. The demands on his charges were enormous, but the results justified the harsh methods. This approach bore fruit, and his students became stars. As for Anya, her success was inextricably linked to her coach. They formed an almost perfect symbiosis. She was the talent. He was the one who uncovered and developed that talent. In the case materials, one could find Jacek Nowak's characterization from the sports committee. Coach Nowak demanded complete dedication. Discipline was the foundation of his system. For him, discipline was not just a word, it was the foundation upon which his entire methodology was built. And now, after the tragedy, it becomes clear that his approach had not only its fruits, but also its price. The price of success in this case turned out to be much higher than anyone could have anticipated. What seemed like a perfect picture to the public actually hid darkness beneath. Being Nowak's protege meant living by his rules, which were harsh and sometimes frightening. But as it turned out, all of this was just the tip of the iceberg. The coach, whose methods brought victories, might have been hiding much more than met the eye. Anya, like other athletes, was part of his system. But what truly lay behind this success, behind this medal, and behind the strict discipline that was so praised by everyone who encountered his system. And now, as the whole story gradually begins to unfold, details are surfacing that force a look at everything from a completely new angle. October 15, 2008. Olympia Swimming Pool. This is the place where, for many years, the country's best divers trained. That evening, everything here seemed normal. But later, this place would become the scene of a tragedy that would force a re-evaluation of the entire picture of what happened. 6:30 p.m. Anya Kowalska, 14 years old, one of the brightest stars of the national team, was preparing for her next dive. During training, she was always distinguished by her composure and high technique. On this day, she was performing a complex exercise. The dive failed. Kowalska slipped, and her attempt ended in failure. These were standard training sessions where all athletes periodically encounter such setbacks. She, like many others, faced difficulties, but always emerged from them with honor. But this time, everything was different. This moment became the last in her life. 6:45 p.m. Training came to an end. The entire team, except for Anya, left the gym and headed to the changing rooms. The atmosphere around began to calm down. Nothing, it seemed, foreshadowed trouble. Everyone went about their business, and even after the failed dive, Anya, as always, showed no signs that she needed anything more than just a little time to recover. But here is where the first deviation from the normal picture appears. 6:55 p.m. Jacek Nowak, the national team coach, called the emergency services. That very moment, which we all know as the culmination, the emergency call that resonated in people's minds as a signal of distress. But what happened in the interval between 6:45 p.m. and 6:55 p.m.? Why does this entire period remain vague? Why did this interval turn out to be so important? Here begins the most important part of the investigation, the 10-minute interval between 6:45 p.m. and 6:55 p.m., a moment that overshadowed everything else. The important thing is that during this time, there was no one in the pool except Coach Nowak and Anya herself. This became a key point that allowed the investigation to doubt the official version of events. No other people were listed in the pool's visitor log in the diving platform area. All other athletes and staff had left that part of the complex. During this interval, the coach and his protege were the only ones in the room. What happened in those 10 minutes? During this time, while all other staff were in the changing rooms, what exactly was happening by the pool? Why did the coach call emergency services after so much time? The police could not ignore this. 10 minutes were enough for something to change. What exactly, while everyone else was in the changing room and no one else was in the pool? Time was a key element in the investigation. Every second, every minute in this chronology mattered. Investigators became confident that this moment required attention. And now, when everything seems to have cleared up, questions begin to arise with renewed force. Why were only they there? How could it be that 10 minutes were enough for the situation to take such a turn? October 17, 2008. A full forensic report arrives at the prosecutor's office in the Polish city where the tragedy occurred. This is the moment when the case takes a completely different turn. What first looked like an accidental tragedy now acquires new, disturbing undertones. The entire official version presented by Coach Nowak begins to crumble. The first concrete scientific conclusion emerges, fundamentally changing the picture. The case is officially reclassified. In the first days of the investigation, the accident version sounded convincing. Coach Nowak, who was with Anya at the time of the incident, asserted that she slipped and fell from a height into the water. He tried to save her, but it was too late. This seemed to be consistent with numerous testimonies and statements from other athletes. But as soon as the examination results came in, the situation changed. The full forensic examination report puts everything in its place. First, the conclusion about the head injury. The blow was to the back of the head. This is important because, if the coach's version were true, Anya should have fallen face first. A fall from a diving platform always occurs in that direction, and according to the description, the head injury should have been to the front of the head. But what did the examination show? The blow was strictly to the back of the head. This means the person was either in a different position or was subjected to an impact before falling. And another extremely important conclusion, Minimal traces of water were found in the deceased's lungs. This already rules out drowning as the primary cause. If she had indeed fallen into the water from the diving platform and drowned, the water content in her lungs would have been much higher. The fact that she did not drown, but most likely was dead before she ended up in the water, now seems obvious. This is a serious contradiction to what the coach said. All of this leads to much more terrifying conclusions. Death did not occur at the moment of impact. It occurred before she ended up in the water. The expert in their conclusion confirms the victim's death occurred before entering the water. This is not just a mistake, not an accident. This is a direct lie on the part of the witness. The scientific data collected during the investigation make the coach's statements impossible. Everything he said could not have been true. Now, Nowak's version of an accident that became a tragedy due to an unsuccessful fall loses all logic. If death occurred before immersion in water, it means something happened before Anya ended up in the water, and something caused it. This is not at all a coach's mistake, but perhaps an attempt to hide the truth. With each new fact, with each piece of evidence, the investigation moves further and further away from the initial version. And now, when the facts say one thing and the coach's testimony contradicts all laws of physics and biology, investigators begin to understand that the case is taking a completely different turn. When investigators began to delve deeper into the details of the case, they focused on one key moment, the time interval from 6:45 p.m. to 6:55 p.m. This was the period when all other athletes left the pool and went to the changing room, leaving Coach Jacek Nowak and Anya Kowalska alone. It was during this interval that the events that led to the tragedy occurred. After it became clear that death occurred before she ended up in the water, the question of who was with Anya at that moment became crucial for the investigation. Investigators began checking the alibis of everyone who could have been in the pool during these 10 minutes. The first to come under scrutiny were other team members. All of them, without exception, confirmed that they were in the shower and changing room between 6:45 p.m. and 6:55 p.m. The testimonies of 7 athletes were unequivocal and consistent with each other. Soon, confirmation of these words came from the pool's technical staff, as well as through surveillance camera recordings that captured who was in different parts of the pool. All these facts ruled out the involvement of other athletes or staff. Each of them had a solid alibi, leaving no room for doubt. The next steps in the investigation concerned Anya Kowalska's parents. The police checked their alibis using mobile operator data. This was a standard procedure that confirmed that they were not near the pool between 6:45 p.m. and 6:55 p.m. At that time, they were far from the sports complex, and their movements completely matched the information provided by the mobile operators. Thus, they were also excluded from the list of possible suspects. By this point, with all possible suspects excluded, the investigation reached a logical and inevitable conclusion. Jacek Nowak was the only person who could have been with Anya during this critical time. He was the only one whose alibi at the time of death was not confirmed. A key entry soon appeared in the investigation records. Jacek Nowak, the only person whose alibi at the time of the victim's death, is absent. This change in status was not just a formality. From this moment on, the coach ceased to be merely a witness to the tragedy and became the main suspect. All the evidence collected by the investigation pointed only to him. The position of the coach, who was a close person to all the athletes and now found himself at the center of the investigation, made this situation even more alarming and confusing. When Jacek Nowak's status changed from witness to main suspect, the investigation could not stop. All the evidence now seemed to point to him, but the question remained, could they prove his guilt? The investigation continued, and the detectives were ready to work with a completely new picture of the crime. After the investigators finished analyzing the testimonies of all adults and checking their alibis, they turned to key witnesses from Anya Kowalska's group. After all, it was they, the athletes who were with her in the last minutes of her life. But what the investigators expected to hear turned out to be just a mask, hiding a much more disturbing picture. Investigators began questioning the athletes, and most of them, as expected, repeated standard phrases learned in the gym. They spoke of a strict but fair coach, of how difficult training was. But it was always clear that it was for the sake of achieving high results. For most of them, the coach's version of the accident was the truth, and they saw no reason to doubt his words. However, among them was one whose behavior sharply stood out from the rest. Magda, 15 years old, Anya's best friend, began to behave strangely from the very beginning. She refused to answer questions, which could not but alarm the investigators. Everyone tried to persuade her to speak, but every question about the day of the tragedy and about the coach caused her fits of panic fear. She sobbed, refused to look at her interrogators, her body convulsed with each new attempt to learn details. Not just horror, but some deep, suppressed fear was legible in her eyes. As the interrogations continued, the psychologist assigned to provide support noticed that Magda's behavior was not a simple manifestation of grief. He recorded signs of acute stress in her. The girl was clearly experiencing something more than just loss. The psychologist confirmed that she had symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, typical for those who have experienced something extremely traumatic. These were not just emotions. This was a state that could not have arisen solely from the loss of a friend. Something happened at the moment when her friend Anya ended up in the pool. Magda's reaction attracted more and more attention. She was not just scared, like others who had lost a loved one. Her fear was something more, and she clearly knew something she could not or would not tell. Investigators, understanding that something important was hidden in her silence, began to shift the focus to her experiences. After the psychologist confirmed the presence of psycho-emotional trauma, the investigation came to an important conclusion. Magda was not just scared. She was most likely a witness to what actually happened. But what exactly did she see that could have caused such horror? Why was her reaction so strong and unusual? At this point, the investigation drew a logical conclusion. Magda could be a key witness, but her silence spoke of something much more disturbing. After the tragedy, when the investigation had already yielded the first important results, the attention of investigators shifted to Jacek Nowak's behavior. His actions became an important element of the investigation, because if the facts were to be believed, he was the last person to be with Anya Kowalska. It was his behavior after the tragedy that could reveal much about his inner state and, possibly, even uncover hidden motives. At first glance, everything Nowak did seemed quite expected. He continued to work as if nothing had happened. On October 17, 2 days after the tragedy, he held a training session with the remaining team members. Everything was on schedule. The training took place in the usual atmosphere, without changes. At this moment, if we looked at the situation from the outside, one might assume that the coach was trying to bring his protégés back to normal life. But for the investigators, this behavior became an alarming signal. The next day, October 18, Nowak gave an interview to a local newspaper. In it, he described the tragedy as an accident, calling on the team to unite and continue training in Anya's name. He spoke about how the tragedy should not break them and that they should continue her work. But how do people react when they lose someone important? How do those who were close react? Usually, such words sound like a call for recovery, but in this context, they seemed strange and cold. Why did the coach not express grief, not stop training, not allow time for mourning? Why did he instead focus on work and image? What was even stranger, the coach himself was completely composed, even despite what was happening. He spoke of it as an event that simply needed to be overcome. His actions, training sessions, interviews, calls to the team not to stop their work, created the impression that he was trying to return everything to normal as quickly as possible. But why was it so important to maintain the status quo? Why was it so important to control the situation so that it did not get out of his hands? And why, instead of immersing himself in grief, did he demonstrate a complete lack of emotional reactions? Investigators could not ignore this. They immediately began to record his behavior. Nowak's behavior became not just strange, but abnormal for them. He did not demonstrate the emotions that usually accompany loss. His actions seemed unnatural, as if he was trying to hide something. For the investigation, this was not just the behavior of a person experiencing loss. This was behavior that could indicate a deep attempt to control the narrative, maintain his version of events, and avoid any manifestations of weakness that could compromise his position. A psychological analysis of his behavior only confirmed these conclusions. The absence of external signs of grief, the attempt to control everything and manipulate public opinion. All of this was part of his strategy. For the investigators, this was an important signal. They concluded that Nowak's actions were not just a reaction to the tragedy, but rather an attempt to hide the truth, to take control of the consequences. Perhaps he was trying to conceal something much more important than what he told the police. October 22nd, 2008. Magda is scheduled for another interrogation. Several days have passed since her first encounter with the police, and the investigation did not leave her alone. Each time she remained silent, refusing to reveal the details of what happened on that fateful day. But this time, everything was different. The psychologist present at the interrogation noticed that she was ready to speak. With each question, her reaction became less defensive, and finally, she broke her silence. At first, her words were quiet, as if she herself didn't believe what she was about to say. But with each moment, Magda became more confident. She spoke of how she saw the last minutes of her friend's life. Magda was not a witness to a murder, but her testimony shattered the version that everything happened by the pool, as the coach claimed. It soon became clear that she had seen something important. Unusual details began to emerge in her story. She recalled how, after the failed dive, Coach Jacek Nowak did not lead Anya back to the diving platform, as everyone else did. Instead, he roughly grabbed her arm and dragged her towards the service corridor that led to the basement. Magda clearly remembered him saying, "Stop embarrassing me. Let's go downstairs. We need to talk." These words shocked her, as they clearly did not fit the image of a coach trying to save his protege. When she told these details to the investigators, they understood that this was not just a random moment. Nowak, according to Magda, led Anya not to a bright and open place, but to a closed, isolated room, the basement, where there was no access and where no one could see what was happening. This discovery radically changed the picture of what occurred. A new location emerged where events could have transpired that changed Anya's life forever. A place that was hidden from prying eyes. The dry hall. It was an ideal place to have a private conversation, or perhaps to do something more terrible. Based on Magda's testimony, investigators began to examine the blueprint of the Olympia swimming pool building. The route she described led directly to the basement. On the plan, there was only one path that converged in one room, Sala Treningu Suchego, or, more simply, the dry hall. There were no surveillance cameras in it, and it was located in an isolated part of the building where one could hide from prying eyes. From this moment on, it became evident that this place could have been the true epicenter of the tragedy. Investigators immediately made a decision to conduct a search of the dry hall without delay. This step was vital to find any evidence that could confirm Magda's words. What she described left no doubt. This was the place where the most important answers were hidden. The understanding of what exactly could have happened here opened up completely new perspectives for the investigation. Now, the question was not what happened by the pool, but what actually happened in that basement where the coach went with Anya. After Magda's testimony shifted the investigation in a new direction, the attention of the investigators focused on the very basement into which the coach had led his protege. This room, previously unnoticed in connection with the tragedy, now became the central object of the investigation. Experts knew that it was here, in the dry hall, that the answers were hidden that could connect all the disparate facts into one convincing chain. A group of forensic experts proceeded to search the dry hall. This room had not been inspected before, as it did not appear in the initial version of the investigation. But now, everything was different. The space was thoroughly examined using the most advanced methods. Luminol, microscopy, and other tools revealed traces that might have been imperceptible to the naked eye of an ordinary person. But for experts, they spoke volumes. The first find was unexpected. At the base of the wall bars, in one of the most difficult to reach areas, a microscopic blue fiber was discovered. It did not immediately attract attention, but forensic experts quickly understood its importance. This was not just debris, it was a trace that could link the coach to the scene of the incident. The fiber turned out to be textile, and its structure aroused suspicion among specialists. But the most important discovery was made with the help of luminol. When the substance touched a certain part of the wall, faint traces began to emerge from the mats that covered the floor. These traces were smudged, but their nature clearly indicated a biological origin. This could not be a coincidence. The important point was that the traces were located in the place where the coach had led his protege. The understanding that this was blood became a key moment for the investigation. The entire team of forensic experts realized that they had not just found an insignificant trace. These findings could become the basis for proving guilt. The samples were immediately sent to the laboratory for deeper analysis. A few days later, The results of the forensic examination confirmed the worst suspicions. The fiber found near the wall bars perfectly matched the fabric of Jacek Nowak's tracksuit. He was wearing this tracksuit on the day of the tragedy, and this was captured on cameras. This was an important confirmation that he, and not someone else, was at that location. But the most striking conclusion came from the DNA laboratory. The analysis showed that the blood found in those very footprints belonged to Anya Kowalska. This became crucial evidence. The connection between the coach, his student, and the crime scene was established. The place no one had thought about before now became the primary evidence in the case. Investigators no longer doubted the tragedy was not an accident. The crime scene, the dry hall, became the epicenter of everything, and now the entire chain of events formed a logical picture. After Magda broke her silence, the investigation began to work in a new direction. The testimony of Anya's friend revealed key moments that changed the entire picture of the incident. Investigators realized that they now needed to speak with other former students of Jacek Nowak. These children, who had left sports long ago, were now ready to speak. Their silence, like Magda's, was not accidental. The testimonies of these people opened their eyes to the system that existed in Olympia under Nowak's leadership. As the investigation delved deeper into the interrogations, new testimonies emerged. Several former athletes confirmed Magda's words and shared their stories. All of them claimed that they had encountered the coach's harsh and often humiliating behavior. These stories became like stones that the investigation could now arrange into a unified picture. It suddenly became clear that the dry hall, which had remained in the shadows for so long, was not just a training place, but a real isolation room for punishments and disciplinary measures. One by one, these witnesses spoke about how the coach used physical punishment, humiliation, and threats to keep his charges under control. In one and the same place, in the dry hall, far from prying eyes, Nowak turned these trainings into hell. They recounted how, on one occasion, after minor mistakes, the coach would shout their surnames, use force to correct technique, or punish for unsuccessful attempts. Everything happened in that same place, in the basement, under his harsh and merciless control. This place became the epicenter of years of suppression and fear that the coach cultivated in his charges. Investigators began to piece these facts into a system, and it soon became clear that Anya's death was not an accidental outburst of anger, but a logical continuation of a long path. The murder was not just a random rage of the coach, it was the result of a years-long system of suppression built by him. This was a finale that followed all previous incidents where Nowak used his position to intimidate and manipulate children. These testimonies provided a clear understanding of how the coach systematically used fear as a tool of control. The investigation reached a new level. There was no longer any doubt. Nowak's behavior was not an exception, but part of a structure in which fear and punishment were the norm. Now, only one important question remained. Why did a successful coach who achieved such heights in sports behave like a sadist? The answer to this question, perhaps, was the key to understanding the entire tragedy. Anya's death was not a random breakdown, but the culmination of a cruel system that Nowak built around himself. After the investigation revealed that Coach Jacek Nowak was the center of the entire tragedy, attention shifted to his personal past. All evidence pointed to his direct involvement in what happened. But now, the most important question remained. Why did he behave this way? Why did this successful coach, standing at the peak of his career, use such a cruel behavioral model? To find the answer, investigators decided to look into his past. Requests were made to the archives of the sports committee to study Nowak's biography before he became a coach. What did his history hide? What caused such an attitude towards students? As it turned out, his sports career, which could have been brilliant, was interrupted at its peak. He was an outstanding diver on whom great hopes were placed, but fate decreed otherwise. A spinal injury at the Olympic qualifying competitions ended his career at 20 years of age. The tragedy, which seemingly would have been the cause of his personal depression, actually turned into a catalyst for his aggressive and cruel behavior. In the injury report that Nowak submitted to the sports committee, he clearly indicated that the cause of the misfortune was coach's error in preparation. This was the first signal of his behavior pattern, always blaming others, not taking responsibility. Now, years later, it became clear that this episode in Nowak's life was the beginning of his internal transformation. He did not just experience trauma, he transferred all his aggression and disappointment onto others, namely, onto his students. These charges, in essence, became for him an extension of his unfulfilled ambitions. He perceived their successes as his own, and their failures as his own setbacks. And that is why every mistake in their training, every deviation from his requirements, was perceived by him as a personal insult. A psychological examination conducted for the investigation confirmed these findings. Based on the collected data, the expert diagnosed signs of narcissistic personality disorder and pathological perfectionism. Nowak created an idealized picture in his head. He was a great coach, and his students had to be perfect like himself. If something went wrong, it was perceived as his personal failure. Therefore, any of their mistakes became a reason for his harsh reaction, for punishment. He was not just a strict coach, he was a person who used his students as tools to realize his own unfulfilled ambitions. Now that psychologists had deciphered Nowak's behavior, investigators understood that his cruelty was not a random outburst. It was systematic, pathological behavior that had developed over many years. Anya's death was not just a random tragedy, it was a logical culmination of years of violence that the coach hid behind a facade of discipline and a desire for victories. Questions about how Nowak could have come to this now became less important. We already knew that he was ready for anything for success, and he perceived his charges as his shadows, as an extension of his own unfulfilled dreams. October 3, 2008. Jacek Nowak finally found himself in the interrogation room. Everything that had seemed like hypotheses and conjectures until this moment now took on clear outlines. In the investigator's hands was a folder with the case, full of evidence that destroyed all the coach's assertions. He was ready for the last conversation that would determine the suspect's future fate. Nowak's status had changed. He was no longer a witness. He became a suspect in murder. The investigator, coldly and methodically, began to lay out the evidence before him. All the evidence collected in recent weeks now lined up in a sequence, and each piece destroyed the lies that Nowak had so stubbornly constructed. The investigator began with the pathologist's report, which clearly indicated that death occurred before the victim entered the water. Death before falling into the water. This was the first statement that knocked the ground from under Nowak's feet. He was sure that the fall from the diving board was the cause, but the examination clearly showed the opposite. The investigator continued. Magda's testimony, the witness who was present in Anya's last moments, became the second blow. She recounted how Nowak led Anya not back to the diving board, but towards the basement, into the dry hall. These words destroyed the coach's version of an accident. And now, to this, another irrefutable piece of evidence was added. A photograph from the laboratory, showing traces of blood belonging to Anya, and a microscopic fiber that matched the fabric of Nowak's tracksuit. All the evidence collected during the investigation formed an impenetrable wall, and now it stood directly before the suspect. Throughout the interrogation, Jacek Nowak remained cold and detached. He did not admit his guilt. His reaction to the presented evidence was typical of a person who had long been accustomed to control and manipulation. He did not break down, did not show fear or confusion. Instead, he began to accuse everyone around him. He claimed that he was being slandered, that Magda was lying, and that the entire incident was an accident. He tried to find an explanation for his actions, but his words sounded increasingly meaningless. "It's a conspiracy. Everyone is against me. Magda is lying. She was in shock, and now everyone is using her words against me," he declared. His claims were so absurd that the investigators could hardly take them seriously. But despite his denials, the collected evidence left no doubt. All the evidence pointed to one thing: he was responsible for everything that happened. The investigator, noting every detail in the protocol, recorded Nowak's words and calmly summarized. This was an accident, adding to the protocol that the lies the coach tried to construct were destroyed with irrefutable evidence. Realizing that he would not get an admission of guilt, the investigation was still confident. This man was guilty, and now all that remained was to officially process the arrest. Following the interrogation, despite Nowak's protests, a warrant for his arrest was issued. The evidence and testimonies collected by the investigation closed all avenues for the coach's acquittal. The whole story was now clear. Cruelty, manipulation, transferred aggression, all of this led to the tragedy. And although Nowak continued to claim that he was being accused without grounds, the truth was already inevitable. There remained one last key question that the investigation had to answer. How did Jacek Nowak move the body from the basement, where, according to testimony, the tragedy occurred, to the pool where it was found? The answer to this question could be the final link in the chain of evidence, definitively destroying the coach's false version of an accidental fall. For this, the investigation decided to use not only witness testimonies, but also technical data that had previously remained out of sight. Investigators began to examine the technical records of the Olympia pool to find out how the transfer could have been carried out unnoticed. They focused on one of the most non-obvious but key elements: the service elevator that connected the basement to the main floors of the building. Elevators are usually not captured by surveillance cameras, but they do leave a record in the system logs. Investigators requested this data, and what they discovered was a crucial finding. The record showed an anomaly that immediately attracted attention. On October 15, at 1851, one of the rare but extremely significant factors was recorded. The elevator made a trip from the lower floor, the basement level where the dry hall was located, to the first floor in the pool area. This was an important discovery, as it confirmed that the elevator was used precisely at the moment when, apparently, the body was moved. The record of the elevator's movement was logged, but video surveillance did not capture the process itself. This was one of the few clues that allowed the investigation to understand that the movement of the body was not accidental, but a deliberate and cold-blooded act. For final certainty, investigators decided to conduct an investigative experiment. They precisely recreated the actions to understand how easily the body could have been moved, and to check how long it took to move from one floor to another. Since Nowak was a physically strong person, and the body's weight was about 45 kilograms, transportation did not pose a problem for the coach. The experiment showed that moving the body from the basement to the pool using the elevator took no more than 3 minutes. This fit perfectly within the 10-minute window of time that remained between the moment everyone left the pool and the moment the call was made to emergency services. Investigators came to the final conclusion. This was not an accidental act, but a carefully planned scheme aimed at staging and concealing the crime. This discovery left no room for doubt. All the pieces of the puzzle fit into one picture. Not only the murder, but also the method of concealing the crime. Everything was planned down to the smallest detail. Jacek Nowak did not just become part of the tragedy, he became its author, manipulating facts and circumstances. From this moment, investigators could confidently state the lie was exposed, and even the cleverest attempts to conceal it could no longer change the picture of what happened. Court session. Silence in the hall. At this moment, everything that had accumulated over months of investigation was to be made public. In the prosecutor's hands, evidence that, like a catalyst, would destroy the last version put forth by Nowak's defense. All the work of investigators and experts came down to one moment, when every piece of evidence would be used to show the truth. The prosecution began the presentation of evidence, and now the entire hall held its breath, waiting for what would become the decisive argument. The prosecutor began with Magda's testimony, recounting how she witnessed Anya's last journey, which began at the pool but continued in the basement, where, according to her, the coach led his charge. This was a key moment that changed the course of the case, and the prosecutor left no room for doubt. He led her downstairs. These words of Magda became the first link in the chain of evidence that, with each step, destroyed Nowak's version of an accidental fall. Then the prosecutor moved on to the evidence obtained at the crime scene. He presented traces of blood and fiber found in the dry hall, right at the scene of the incident, which also matched the fabric of Nowak's tracksuit. Every item found in the basement was confirmed by expertise and indicated that the tragedy occurred precisely there, in an isolated space. Therefore, the coach's assertions that everything happened at a height could not be true. The last piece of evidence that the prosecutor presented in court was data on the movement of the service elevator, which, according to records, recorded a trip from the basement to the first floor at the right time, October 15, at 1851. This was the time when, according to the investigation's version, the body had already been moved, and now it was even physically possible to explain how Nowak could easily and unnoticed transport Anya to the pool where she was later found. Every piece of evidence, every word, every testimony formed an undeniable chain that left no room for the defense. The version of an accident, which Nowak stubbornly held onto, was completely refuted. Every link in the investigation strengthened the accusation, and everything became obvious. Anya's death was not an accident. It was a cold-blooded crime, planned and executed with calculation. When the prosecutor finished presenting the evidence, it was the defense's turn. Jacek Nowak was given the floor. He did not utter a single word of remorse. Instead, he again began to deny all charges. "It's all lies. Magda is lying. It was an accident. Everything was staged." His words were nothing more than an attempt to justify himself, to hide the truth. He continued to insist on his version of events, despite the fact that all the collected evidence pointed to the contrary. Nowak's words sounded empty, like pathetic attempts to save face. There was not a hint of remorse on his face, only desperate resistance that could not change what had already been proven. There was no confession, but there was no need for it. His version was finally exposed, and in this hall, there was no longer any doubt about his guilt. The interrogation protocol, where he refused to give testimony, became the last document confirming his refusal to admit guilt. The look on Nowak's face at that moment was ruthless. There was no repentant person, but a liar, exposed in his own lies. At that moment, time seemed to slow down. Behind this silence stood nothing but empty excuses that no one was interested in anymore. Now that all the evidence had been collected, the investigation could present the final version of what happened on that fateful day. With each new piece of evidence, it became clearer. The tragedy was not a random outburst of anger, but part of a carefully planned crime. The investigation put all the elements together into a single picture, and now it only remained to reconstruct the chronology of events. October 3, 2008. Jacek Nowak, after a conflict with Anya, led her to the basement, to the dry hall, where no one could see them. In this isolated room, the last, fatal scene began. The conflict between them quickly flared up. Something in Anya's behavior enraged the coach, and in a moment of fury, he used force. Pushing her, he could not prevent what happened next. Anya's head hit the metal edge of the wall bars hard. It was a fatal blow. When he realized she was showing no signs of life, his first thought was how to cover up what had happened. Instead of calling for help, he instantly made a decision that would later play a key role in his exposure. He carried her lifeless body to the elevator and, without slowing his steps, went down to the basement to use the service elevator. For several minutes, as the elevator moved from the basement to the first floor, he was already concocting his lie, preparing a staging that was meant to conceal the true causes of what happened. Passing through the service corridor, he brought her to the pool. The elevator, unnoticed by cameras, became his ally, moving the body from one floor to another. A few minutes later, he threw her into the water, pretending it was an accident. Later, after concealing the traces, he made a call to emergency services, reporting a tragedy, as if an uncontrolled incident had occurred. He tried to make all responsibility fall on chance, and not on his own hands. Now that everything was assembled, the investigation could give an accurate legal qualification to what happened. This was not just a murder committed in a fit of rage, it was a premeditated murder with indirect intent and subsequent obstruction of justice. Everything he did was part of a plan that he had meticulously thought out to cover his tracks. This cold-blooded reconstruction of events finally closed all logical gaps. There was no accident. Everything that happened was the result of years of psychology, of manipulation, perfectionism, and a desire for control. Nowak tried to avoid responsibility for his actions, hiding them behind a mask of randomness, but the evidence spoke for itself. July 2009. In the district court of Wrocław, the moment arrived to which the investigation had been leading for several months. In the dock, Jacek Nowak, a coach who became a symbol of cruel manipulation and suppression. The case that shocked the entire country had now reached its final stage. All the evidence collected by the investigation left no room for doubt. All the evidence, from witness testimonies to forensic data, led to the same conclusion: Nowak was guilty. The jury retired to deliberate. A tense silence hung in the courtroom. Everyone in the hall knew that this moment was the culmination of the entire tragedy. The only question was, how long would the jury deliberate before reaching a decision? Despite the gravity of the charges and the irrefutable evidence, the question of the fairness of the decision remained open. And then, after some time, the court returned with a verdict. Jacek Nowak is found guilty on all counts, the judge said. And these words immediately became the final point in this case. The court found no mitigating circumstances. All the evidence, from witness testimonies to expert conclusions, led to one thing. It was a cold-blooded murder, planned and executed with calculation. Obstruction of justice, an attempt to stage an accident, all these were links in the same chain, and now this heavy burden lay on the defendant. Then the judge pronounced the sentence. For the murder of a minor and obstruction of justice, Jacek Nowak is sentenced to 25 years of imprisonment. This was a sentence that was supposed to deliver justice, restore balance to a world shattered by his crime. 25 years, a term that seemed just in the context of the gravity of the deed. For Nowak, there was no forgiveness, no relief. His actions were deemed criminal, and at the time of sentencing, he remained in his defensive posture, trying to justify himself. But all his attempts could not change his fate. The cruelty with which he manipulated people, his coaching authority that he used for suppression, all of this was eradicated by the final court decision. The verdict was not just fair, it was a necessary step to at least partially restore justice for those whom Nowak had hurt and used for his own ambition. And although life would not return to its former course, this step was important for everyone who was under his control and for those who suffered at his hands. Nowak's case is closed, but its echo continues to resonate. The tragedy that shocked the country did not end with the verdict. The changes that followed the trial became inevitable. As a result, it received long-awaited recognition, but left an indelible mark on society. What changed after the last page of this case was turned. In the Olympia pool, where everything began, the management changed. New rules for working with underage athletes, established immediately after the investigation, became mandatory. Now, surveillance cameras are installed not only in common areas, but also in service corridors, where events that previously remained unchecked occurred. These changes were a reaction to that terrible incident, and they could not but affect everyone who had ever been connected with this place. Magda, the key witness, was unable to continue her sports career. The fear and trauma she experienced became unbearable for her, and she left her sports career forever. This fact, of course, could not but leave its mark on the entire story. For her, as for many others, this incident became not just a tragedy, but a definitive break with what she once loved. But the consequences of this case were not limited to just the pool and the lives of a few people. The case of Jacek Nowak caused widespread public outcry, becoming a real precedent in Poland. This was not just an investigation into one case, but the beginning of a new discussion about sports education and permissible methods of working with young athletes. The Minister of Sport of Poland then initiated large-scale inspections in sports schools across the country, and also tightened requirements for the psychological training of coaches. In a country where coaches were often perceived as authorities whose methods were not questioned, this was an important step towards change. As for Olympia, despite everything, the pool continued its work. However, the very dry hall where the murder occurred was completely re-equipped and renamed. It became a symbol of change, a testament to the fact that even the most terrible events can lead to important and necessary steps aimed at improving and ensuring the safety of future generations. The police arrived at the abandoned warehouse after receiving a strange call. Workers conducting a site inspection discovered an unusual object that caught their attention. At first glance, it was just a forgotten box, nothing remarkable, but something in its appearance made them wary. Several officers arrived at the scene following the call. During their inspection of the warehouse, they found a large cardboard box. Brown stains were visible on the outside, and a strange symbol adorned its sides. This sign immediately attracted attention, though no one could explain what it might mean. However, its presence, like the stains, suggested that something serious might be hidden there. When experts at the scene conducted the first test, the result was alarming. The stains indeed turned out to be blood. At this moment, it became clear that the warehouse was a crime scene. Everything indicated that the box might be connected to something much more dangerous than just a forgotten item. The officers began to open the box. This was done slowly, carefully, so as not to damage the contents. When the lid was lifted, a body was found inside. It was a young woman whose face seemed familiar. It was difficult to say exactly what had happened, but it immediately became clear that what they had found was no accident. Everything that happened at the warehouse pointed to a serious crime. And although this discovery answered the first question, it raised new ones. Now they had to figure out who she was, how she ended up there, and what was behind her disappearance. When the identification was complete, all the details that previously seemed distant and impersonal finally became real. The officers standing next to the mother couldn't help but notice how her face changed the moment she confirmed this was her daughter, Layla, 8 years old. This name, which had just become not just a sad stamp in a report, but a living personal testimony to a terrible reality. The mother, like everyone in the small town, seemed part of a normal, everyday life. Her name was familiar to neighbors. She, like most people here in Edmonton, had an ordinary job, lived in a small house on the outskirts. The men at the construction site and the women in the shops spoke of her as a kind and caring mother. Everything was as it should be in a quiet, peaceful town. Layla went to school, played with neighborhood children, and on weekends, the whole family often spent time in the park. This was a world where there was no place for tragedy. Layla's family, her mother, and older brother Max, middle class like most people in this area. They weren't famous, didn't stand out in any special way, but also didn't have problems that neighbors would talk about. An ordinary family where no one expected to see a drama similar to what happened. Layla's life was the same as other children her age. Moments of joy, playing with friends, simple worries. All of this was suddenly cut short in an instant. The police began checking records. Someone desperately tried to find at least one explanation for how this could have happened. Layla disappeared, but at this moment, no one knew that this very disappearance would ultimately lead to this place. Search parties, concerned about the events, continued to look for her, but without any concrete leads. And then, as soon as the identification was complete, the police turned to the database. A check under the name Layla confirmed that a missing person report had been filed 2 days ago, on May 1. This meant that the family had contacted the police, but at that time, there was no understanding that something like this would happen. Now the case was closed. The disappearance and this terrible discovery were linked. What started as an ordinary problem suddenly turned into something much darker. The terrible truth became obvious. Layla had disappeared, and her disappearance was not accidental. Layla's last actions were recorded, around 2 p.m. May 1. It was at this time that she left home, deciding to go to the local park. Layla's mother, who was at home at the time of the disappearance, said that her daughter had often planned to go to the park to play with friends. This was a common plan, just like many other plans Layla made every day. The expectation that she would return in a few hours was absolutely normal, as such meetings with friends always brought her joy. But this time, something went wrong. According to her mother, Layla never returned home. Time passed, and worry began to grow. At first, it seemed trivial, as the girl could have been delayed, simply losing track of time while playing in the park. But evening was approaching, and the anxiety grew stronger. The next day, the police began interviewing witnesses, trying to find out if Layla had reached the park. This step was logical, to check if she was at the destination, as such details could provide a clue to her disappearance. Friends she was supposed to meet at the park confirmed that Layla did not show up. This confirmed the worst fears. The girl did not reach the park, and something happened on the way. The police began to narrow down the search, trying to understand where she might have been and why she wasn't where everyone expected to see her. This information introduced even more uncertainty, fueling suspicions of a possible criminal background to the disappearance. Late in the evening of the same day, Layla's mother contacted the police. The statement was taken, and the official process began. This became a turning point. The mother's concern turned into an official investigation. At that time, there was no evidence of a violent disappearance, but the uncertainty, the lack of traces, and the friends' testimonies began to form an alarming picture. Layla was registered as a missing person. The next morning, the search began. At first, these were standard actions: interviewing local residents, searching the area, checking all possible routes the girl might have taken. Time passed, and the search became more intense. The police deployed more and more resources, but in the first few days, not the slightest trace was found that could provide any explanation for what was happening. At this point, a new phase of the investigation began. The question of what happened to Layla was openly posed. The disappearance, which began as an accident or a simple delay, was now becoming more and more mysterious and grim. But at that time, no one yet knew that terrible revelations lay ahead, which would lead to a discovery that shocked the entire city. As soon as the case was registered with the police, the investigation began in full force. The police immediately proceeded with standard steps, interviewing relatives, Layla's friends, and everyone who might know what happened. In those days, this was a routine process. They checked every step the girl took, her path to the park, asked neighbors passing by, and tried to determine if she had been seen anywhere else for the last time. All these efforts, though seemingly obvious, did not yield significant results. Layla's parents were interviewed, and on the first day nothing was found that could indicate any oddities in the girl's behavior or special circumstances of her disappearance. Neighbors whom Layla knew also could not provide anything new. Everyone said the same thing. She just went to the park, as she always did. She did not report any problems or unusual situations. The park was not far, and there were no alarming signs. Following this, the police sent a group of people to comb the area. They covered all possible routes Layla could have taken. Nearby yards, parks, abandoned buildings. Everything that could be checked was examined. But despite thorough searches, no traces of the girl were found. The next day, the investigation began to attract more attention. The police decided to use surveillance cameras in the area. Requests for footage were sent to nearby buildings, stores, and places where a video surveillance system might be installed. But here, as often happens in such cases, one problem arose. It turned out that most of the cameras were not working, and those that were on did not record the necessary areas. This created significant difficulties for the investigation. The task of obtaining even one shot that could help in the search seemed almost impossible. Nevertheless, one recording was obtained from a building located near the warehouse, but its quality left much to be desired. This was the last, and, as it turned out, the only lead. Experts began to study the camera footage, which showed only blurry silhouettes, but this was enough to draw attention to some details. The expert deciphering the recording examined the frames, trying to understand exactly what the camera had captured. The video file was of low quality, the image blurry, but several figures on the screen began to attract attention. The recording shows two silhouettes. One is an adult man, the other is a shorter person. Movement in the frame indicates that they are heading towards the warehouse where the body was later found. It is important that these silhouettes were moving in a direction that could well be related to the crime scene. This was an important detail. Despite the poor quality of the recording, it became the first real clue in the investigation that could initiate new steps. While nothing was certain yet, the police now faced a specific question. Who were these people? And what was their connection to Layla's disappearance? The camera footage became a key element that pointed the direction of the investigation. And although its value remained questionable due to a lack of clarity, the fact that important moments were captured on it became a turning point in this case. Investigators understood that they would now need to carefully examine the possible connections of this man to Layla's disappearance. After experts examined the camera footage, all attention shifted to a possible suspect. Given that the video quality left much to be desired and the silhouettes on the recording were blurry, the hope for direct identification was slim. The face of the man captured in the frames was indiscernible. All that was visible were figures walking towards the warehouse, but there were no clear signs that could aid in identification. The recording was presented to Layla's mother. Her heart pounded as she watched each frame, trying to recognize the person in some way. Many times she re-watched this video, but each time her attention turned to the silhouettes, all she could make out were dark contours and sharp movements. At some point, the mother began to focus on small but still noticeable details. She paused the video, enlarged the image, and began to scrutinize the man's gait. His walk seemed familiar to her. The screen showed a characteristic posture, a manner of movement that was not unknown to her. Layla's mother couldn't precisely explain what this person reminded her of, but her intuition told her that she had seen a similar gait nearby. With each new second watched, she assured herself that it was someone she knew. After a few minutes of reflection, she said, "It's him. it's our neighbor. This was a rather subjective conclusion, but she felt it wasn't just a coincidence. Perhaps the gate, which remained in her memory, could provide the police with the clue they needed. Her certainty that the man in the recording was familiar led the investigation to a new stage. The mother named the neighbor, James. He lived just 100 meters from their house, and they often crossed paths on the street. He was a middle-aged man, quiet, and nothing out of the ordinary in his life. He was even known to Layla's family, though not a close friend. James, like many others, was one of those neighbors whom few would notice if not for this strange moment in the video. The police immediately entered his name into the report. James's geographical proximity to Layla's home and his sudden appearance in the recording added weight to the suspicions. This was an important coincidence that made investigators focus on him. Of course, this was only an initial assumption, and the investigation could not immediately assert that he was guilty, but his figure in the video and his connection to the crime scene now became evident. James became the first suspect in the case. Although there was no evidence of his guilt at that time, he found himself in the spotlight. The suspicions were justified. A person living so close, someone who could know where to go and what to do if he wanted to hide his tracks. This was enough to start a more thorough investigation. The investigation proceeded to gather additional data about James. The police began checking his possible connections to Layla's family and also studying his behavior over the past few weeks. Who was he? How long had he lived near them? Did he have any problems? This man, who had been completely inconspicuous before, became the focus of the investigation. Suspicion was established, but for now, James remained just a suspect. The police faced the question: what to do next? How to prove that he was connected to Layla's disappearance? The answers to these questions depended on what evidence and testimony could be collected in the near future. After the case entered a more active phase, all investigative attention was focused on analyzing the evidence found. The main task was to understand what could provide additional clues regarding what happened. One of the most important stages was the forensic expert's conclusion, which could answer the main questions. Exactly how the incident occurred and what could have led to such a tragedy. The expert meticulously examined all possible traces on the body and concluded there were no signs of struggle. This seemed strange, especially considering that the disappearance occurred in an open place, and the girl could have encountered someone on her way. Usually such incidents are accompanied by at least minimal struggle or signs of resistance. However, no matter how hard they tried, no characteristic scratches or injuries were found, which would indicate active self-defense. The cause of death was determined to be asphyxia, strangulation. This meant that the attack was swift and decisive, and most likely it happened at a moment when the victim did not expect danger. However, the absence of signs of struggle raised more questions than it answered. It was obvious that this crime was not spontaneous. Someone knew how to approach and what to do without arousing suspicion. Everything indicated that the perpetrator acted confidently and methodically. This turned the case into something more complex than a simple incident. And now, with the main expert examination results known, the investigation's attention shifted to the symbol depicted on the box where Layla was found. The symbol became an important guide in the investigation. It was a mysterious mark that attracted the attention of everyone who saw it. Many specialists began working with this element. The police sent the image for examination to forensic laboratories, as well as to cult specialists. Expectations were high. Perhaps the symbol was part of a known religious or occult practice, which could provide additional clues about the perpetrator's motives. However, all searches in existing databases yielded no results. The symbol was not found in any known groups associated with such practices. This discovery further complicated the case. What initially looked like a potential clue now became a complete mystery. This whole story began to seem even more irrational than before. The symbol, which should have pointed to a possible explanation, turned out to be unidentified. This cast doubt on the theory of a ritualistic nature of the crime, which specialists might initially have suggested. The resulting picture now became even more contradictory. The murder was not associated with a struggle, and the symbol on the box had neither a rational nor an irrational explanation. This put the investigation at a dead end. The surprising combination of events and facts indicated that what was happening was not an ordinary crime. The murder did not appear ritualistic, and the fact that the symbol had no known meaning only emphasized the strangeness of what was happening. Now the investigation had to unravel this contradiction. What could be behind this crime? What kind of person could be capable of such actions? And why was the murder committed in precisely this way? The origin of the symbol was becoming a key, but its meaning remained a mystery that required solving. After James was listed as a suspect, the investigation began to work on his version of events. It was important to understand what he was doing on the day of Layla's disappearance and where he was on May 1. He was first interviewed on May 5, several days after his name came to the attention of the police. This interrogation became a turning point because it was supposed to provide answers that could either exonerate him or make him the main suspect. During the interrogation, James was asked about his whereabouts on the day Layla disappeared. This is a standard question always asked of suspects: where he was and what he was doing. James's answer was short and firm. He stated that on the day of Layla's disappearance, he spent the entire day at home, alone. This was his alibi, but as it turned out, it did not stand up to scrutiny. It was hard not to notice that his version seemed too simple and convenient, but as in any investigation, the police had to verify every fact. They began interviewing neighbors to corroborate his alibi. This is a common procedure, but in this case, it became a crucial moment. The interviews proved to be more than useful. Two neighbors who lived near James's house reported seeing him on that very day, May 1, in the vicinity of the abandoned warehouse. They claimed it was indeed him, and even described him as the same man they often saw, which confirmed their certainty in this observation. This testimony sharply contrasted with his statement that he had been home all day. Now, with the witnesses' testimonies clearly contradicting James's words, the investigation proceeded to compare this data. The interrogation protocols of James and the neighbors' testimonies were compared. At first glance, it seemed that it might just be a misunderstanding, but the discrepancies were too obvious to ignore. James's statements did not match reality, and now his lie became evident. This moment became critical in the investigation. James's lie, uncovered thanks to the neighbors' testimonies, cast doubt on his entire version. He could not explain why he was seen at the location connected to the investigation, at a time when he claimed to be at home. This contradiction significantly weakened his position and made him the primary suspect. Investigators knew that this was not yet conclusive evidence, but now, considering the inconsistencies in his story, James was in the spotlight. Lying at such an important moment made him highly suspicious. It remained to be understood how exactly his actions were connected to Layla's disappearance. On May 5, after James's first interrogation, the investigation proceeded to conduct the first search of his home. This was an important moment, as the police had to check for any evidence that could confirm or refute the suspicions. Preparation for the search was thorough, as the investigators' assumptions were based on eyewitness testimonies and conflicting facts related to James's alibi. However, no matter how carefully the operation was prepared, the result turned out to be completely unsatisfactory. The process was typical for such situations. The search was conducted in James's living quarters, hoping to find something that would link him to Layla's disappearance. However, despite all efforts, no evidence that could confirm his guilt was found. Every detail was checked. Wardrobes, drawers, James's personal belongings were examined, but everything looked as if he was not involved in this crime. This created the impression that the case could drag on, and James might turn out to be innocent. But the investigation did not stop there. The unsatisfactory result of the first search did not mark the end of the investigation, and the police had long been accustomed to the emptiness they sometimes had to overcome in their search for the truth. Based on the neighbors' testimonies and the counter-version of his alibi, it was decided to conduct a second search, and now the focus shifted to other premises that might not have been thoroughly checked earlier. A second warrant was issued on May 7. It included not only living quarters, but also non-residential ones. James's garage, which few people visited, and which could hide some long-forgotten things. After all, garages usually store everything that is not used daily. Old boxes, tools, unnecessary papers. In such an environment, it would be easy to miss something. This was a logical step, given the unclear situation and the need to check every detail. The investigative team proceeded with the search without high expectations, but with the hope that some new traces might be found. The inspection process was routine. Everything was in order. Old tools, some car parts, old boxes with papers, unwanted items. Every corner was checked, and everything seemed as ordinary as everything before. However, among the clutter in the corner of the garage, upon careful inspection, an old personal notebook was found. At first glance, nothing unusual, but when the investigators opened it, they found something shocking. On one of the pages was drawn a symbol, the very same one that was depicted on the box where the body was found. This was a stunning discovery. The symbol, which had been the very thing that caught the investigation's attention, now turned out to be directly linked to James. The drawing found in his notebook was an exact copy of what was on the box. The evidence that could explain the strange symbol was now in hand. This fact became a turning point in the investigation, and it was this that connected James to the crime. Now there was undeniable evidence that placed him at the center of the investigation. The symbol, which had seemed like just a strange detail, suddenly became a key that opened up a whole series of questions for the investigators. How did it end up in James's notebook? Why was this symbol so closely connected to the crime scene? All of this put James in an extremely uncomfortable position, and now, even despite his denials, the investigation had a clear guide for further action. Step by step, the investigation gathered evidence to definitively link James to the crime. One of the most crucial factors that could conclusively confirm his guilt was genetic testing. The box on which blood traces were found needed to be analyzed to prove its connection to Layla's disappearance. The blood left on the box was sent to a laboratory for DNA analysis. The process was standard, but very important. Blood samples taken from the surface of the box were examined. They were carefully compared with Layla's profile, which had been obtained earlier from other sources. The result left no doubt. It was Layla's blood. This meant that the box in which her body was found indeed belonged to her. 100% match. And this fact became a strong argument against James. He could no longer deny his connection to the crime, as the blood on the box clearly indicated that it was part of his criminal actions. But for the investigation, this was not enough. They knew that the case was not limited to biological traces alone. To confirm their theory, they needed to make sure that the symbol itself, found in James's notebook, was also connected to this crime. The very symbol drawn in the notebook, which was found in James's garage, had to be investigated. Graphological expertise allowed another important step to be taken. Investigators sent the notebook for examination to check if the drawing was made by James's hand. During the examination, samples of his handwriting and the characteristics of the lines in the drawing were compared. In the hands of specialists, the drawing turned out to be identical to his writing style. This became another weighty piece of evidence. The graphologist's conclusion: the drawing was made by James's hand. This was more than convincing. The symbol found in his notebook not only matched the one drawn on the box, but also confirmed his involvement in the case. However, this was not enough. Experts needed to understand why James drew this symbol. What was behind this drawing, and how was it connected to the person himself? Following biological and graphological analyses, the investigation decided to turn to psychology. Understanding the perpetrator's motives became the next step. Why did he choose such a strange symbol? It was not a random element. Everything pointed to deeper, personal reasons. James's psychological examination became the next important stage of the investigation. Specialists analyzed his behavior and also studied all the found drawings. They tried to understand what could have prompted him to such strange actions. The drawing on the box and in the notebook was not just a random graphic element. It likely had deep personal meaning for James, which could not be understood without analyzing his psychological state. At the request of the investigation, a comprehensive assessment of his personality was conducted. The preliminary conclusion of the experts left no doubt. James suffered from a serious mental disorder. This conclusion did not justify his actions, but began to explain why he might commit something so strange and cruel. He drew this symbol because it was part of his mental state, unconsciously connected with his inner experiences. This discovery raised a new question for the investigation. How could such a disorder affect his behavior, and what actions was he prepared to take next? With each new analysis, each result, the investigation became more and more focused on James. Biological, graphological, and psychological evidence all pointed to him. The investigation was now ready to move forward, as they not only knew who was connected to this crime, but also began to understand why it happened. The investigation continued to work, not only on James's version, but also considered other possible paths. In such cases, when facts and evidence do not provide an unambiguous answer, every option must be checked, including those who may be close to the victim. First and foremost, this concerned the family itself. In particular, the investigation's attention was drawn to Layla's brother, Max. Interrogation protocols indicated the presence of certain conflicts within the family. The older brother and sister did not always have a good relationship. Circumstances such as personal grievances or quarrels could have become a possible motive. Although such cases are quite rare, suspicions concerned everyone who might have been close to the victim. Checking versions, including options with relatives, is always a standard procedure in investigations. What if the crime is connected to this? Max temporarily received the status of a person subject to verification. This did not mean his direct involvement, but the investigation was obliged to consider all options. Several factors weighed against him: conflicts with his sister, family ties, and proximity. The standard interrogation, as always, was to find out where he was on the day Layla disappeared. The question asked to all suspects in such cases: what was he doing on May 1, the day of the disappearance? Then the usual investigative work began: inquiries, alibi checks. To confirm or refute the version, the police interviewed Max's friends and his coach. Investigators found that on the day of the disappearance, he was at sports practice as he claimed. Max's alibi was confirmed by the coach, who gave detailed testimony, as well as by 10 other members of his team. This was accurate, undeniable proof that left no room for doubt. As soon as the evidence confirmed Max's alibi, his status in the case was reviewed. Investigators compiled a report officially stating that he had been excluded from the circle of suspects. This meant that the line of investigation concerning the brother was closed. Now, the full weight of the investigation again fell on James. However, this did not mean that the investigation could relax. On the contrary, they began to work even more thoroughly. It soon became clear that no evidence linking Max to Layla's disappearance would be found. This led to a new level of understanding. He was innocent. And now, attention was completely focused on James. His strange behavior, lies about his whereabouts, and connection to the symbol on the box increasingly alarmed the investigation. The investigation could not simply stop at James's current behavior. Every aspect of his life, every step he took in the past, now represented an important element that could shed light on his motivation. To understand why he committed this crime, investigators decided to go back to his past. One of the first steps in this direction was to study his life before moving to Edmonton. Inquiries were sent to police archives in the cities where James lived before he appeared in Edmonton. Basic checks like these are always an integral part of an investigation. The police needed to find out if James had any prior problems with the law, or if he had any incidents of contact with authorities. This data, which at first glance might seem insignificant, could become key to understanding his behavior. The results of the check immediately attracted attention. Although James himself was not involved in major crimes, 2 disturbing incidents were discovered in his past. In both cases, people contacted the police with complaints about James's strange behavior. He was seen obsessively watching children on playgrounds. These complaints did not lead to accusations, as in each case there was not enough evidence to initiate a case. But the appeals themselves showed disturbing symptoms that could not be ignored. Documents from the archives indicated that in both cases, the complaints concerned his behavior when he observed children for a long time. In one of the incidents, according to neighbors' testimony, James often sat in his car near the playground, intently watching the children playing there. In another case, he was seen standing near a group of children and carefully observing their games. Although no charges were filed, the facts themselves showed that his behavior left disturbing traces. These moments were ignored, but now they were surfacing again. Investigators understood that while these incidents might have seemed random at the time, they now looked like important signals indicating James's unusual and sometimes dangerous inclinations. These 2 cases did not become criminal cases because no corpus delicti was proven, but they became an important part of the picture that was emerging regarding James. When these incidents were compared with the current investigation, it became obvious that his behavior followed a certain disturbing pattern. He was not simply involved in strange circumstances related to Layla's disappearance. His life before that was also filled with elements of deviant behavior. Obsessive observation of children, it turned out, was not accidental, but systematic. This was important because it allowed the investigation to identify a pattern that now stood at the center of the investigation. Comparing James's past and present now allowed investigators to understand that his motives were not random. He was a person who had long shown an interest in children, and now that interest had taken a more sinister form. Everything indicated that his behavior over many years had gradually become more irrational and dangerous. This was not a random crime, but part of a pattern that became clearer with each new element of the investigation. James's past now became part of his personality, and it explained why he could have committed such a crime. He had a stable behavior pattern that indicated an unhealthy interest in children. This knowledge strengthened suspicions that his actions were not accidental, but part of a deeper and more disturbing problem that the investigation was now ready to uncover. On May 10, during another interrogation, James faced an unbearably difficult ordeal. The investigator began with the most powerful piece of evidence, a notebook found in the suspect's garage. This was not just an object, but a real link to the crime, and the investigator was sure that this evidence would be the turning point that would break James's defense. He carefully placed the notebook on the table in front of James and slowly said, "What is this drawing? Why was it in your notebook?" The question was direct and incredibly powerful at the same time. The symbol found in the notebook exactly matched the one drawn on the box where Layla was later found. This could not be a coincidence. James, not expecting such a direct attack, fell silent. He did not try to justify himself. There was not a single word, not the slightest reaction. He simply remained silent, which in itself said more than any words. It was a silence that left no doubt. He had no answer to this question. The investigator continued the pressure. He knew he needed to press James, giving him no time to think. He moved on to the second, equally important, piece of evidence, the false alibi. The investigator knew that James claimed to have been home all day on May 1, but neighbors' testimonies contradicted his words. He could lie, but the testimonies of people who saw him near the warehouse cast doubt on everything he said. "You were seen near the warehouse on May 1. Why didn't you mention it?" The investigator continued, revealing new facts to James. The investigator's tone was harsh. He read out the testimonies of witnesses who accurately described his actions that day. James, beginning to get nervous, started to answer disjointedly. His words became confused. He would start to answer one thing and then change his mind a second later. There was no confidence in his answers, only confusion. This was a key moment. If at first he tried to remain calm, now his face began to show signs of tension. He clearly felt his defense crumbling. When the investigator stood up and presented James with the results of the psychological examination, the atmosphere in the room became even heavier. This was the final blow to his psychological state, to his personal characteristics. The conclusion of experts who studied his behavior and reactions confirmed that he suffered from mental disorders. The question was not how sane he might be, but how his disorders might affect his actions. The psychological profile, compiled based on observations of his behavior, became the last nail in his defense. At first, James still tried to justify himself, but soon, his face contorted, he clearly withdrew. His gaze became detached, as if he had stopped perceiving what was happening around him. "I don't remember it. Perhaps it wasn't me," he said in response to the last questions, and these words became the final moment of the interrogation. This was not a confession, but it was obvious that James was not ready to take responsibility for what he had done. His words could be interpreted as detachment from what was happening, as an admission that he did not feel guilty, although he understood that everything pointed to his involvement. The investigators recorded this phrase in the protocol. It became a key moment in the case. Although there was no confession, the refusal to take responsibility and the uncertainty in his words put everything in a new context. The interrogation showed that James was trying to evade the truth, but all his behavior, all the evidence, all the examinations pointed to the same person. After James's interrogation yielded no conclusive results, the investigation continued to search for new leads. Even after all the evidence and psychological pressure, questions remained that required clear answers. Investigators understood that to truly break the suspect, they needed to find undeniable evidence that would definitively tie him to the crime. The case seemed to be nearing a dead end. At first glance, everything had already been checked. James's alibi, his behavior, the evidence found in his home, and even the results of the psychological examination. However, investigators could not shake the feeling that somewhere, perhaps, there was something they had missed. Time did not stand still, and the investigation continued to work, never giving up. Soon it was decided to conduct a second search of the area. Usually, such steps did not yield significant results, as all key locations had already been thoroughly inspected. But this time, something changed. One of the teenagers who lived nearby mentioned that he had been filming a video on his phone on the day Layla disappeared. He noted that there was nothing unusual in the video, but the area where the abandoned warehouse was located was visible in the shot. This was a random lead, but it could become important. Experts immediately seized the video recording. At first glance, the content of the video was insignificant. The entire recording was mainly dedicated to teenagers playing, and there was nothing in it that would immediately draw attention. However, experts carefully reviewing the material noticed a strange detail. In the background of the video, in one of the corners of the frame, activity was visible near the abandoned warehouse, the very one where the body was later found. It was a minor detail, but it instantly became crucial evidence. Investigators immediately began the process of image enhancement. Digital processing allowed for a clearer image, making the picture more distinct. With each new frame, it became obvious that the video captured a person dragging a large box towards the warehouse. And finally, the moment that completely changed the course of the investigation. After zooming in and stabilizing the image, the video clearly shows James dragging the box inside the warehouse. This moment became the final and irrefutable proof of his involvement in the crime. There was no longer any doubt. The irrefutable recording, made by chance, became the key that completely destroyed his defense. All doubts vanished. James was linked to the crime scene, and his attempts to deny his involvement seemed futile. The investigation was now ready to move to the next stage: arrest and formal charges. On May 15, a tense silence hung in the interrogation room. The investigator, unwavering in his goal, decided to confront James with the facts. A video file appeared on the laptop screen. The investigator silently spent a few seconds, giving the suspect an opportunity to watch the recording. This was his last weapon, a video that unequivocally showed James dragging the box into the abandoned warehouse. Every frame was important, but now the full weight of the evidence rested on James. He could no longer deny his involvement. James stared at the screen. There was no surprise, fear, or rage in his eyes, only emptiness. He did not try to justify himself, did not start to defend himself, did not utter a single word. His entire reaction was in this silence. He just sat, watched, and did not move, as if understanding that now anything he said would not change the situation. The investigator, noticing this, did not rush to continue. He turned off the video, and the room filled with silence. This pause was heavy and long. Time seemed to stop, and the air itself felt saturated with tension. The protocol recorded this pause. It seems that at that moment, James began to realize that all the evidence was against him. But he didn't say a word. He sat in the shadow of his silence, trying somehow to cope with the internal pressure. The silence between him and the investigator lasted for several minutes, and every moment it seemed that something was about to happen. Then, finally, he broke the silence. James, shifting in his chair, quietly said, "I didn't mean to kill her." These simple words, spoken in a quiet voice, became the culmination of the entire investigation. It was not a confession in the full sense, but a phrase that brought closure. He admitted his involvement, but tried to somehow minimize his actions. It was obvious that his words were not an attempt to justify, but also not full responsibility for what he had done. "I didn't mean to kill her." This became his phrase, recorded in the protocol. And it was this that put everything in its place. James did not fight the facts. His silence and this phrase became evidence that his psyche was destroyed under the weight of the evidence. He did not try to deny his actions, but also could not fully admit his guilt. Thus, the second stage of the investigation concluded, and the investigation faced a new challenge: to understand James's real motivation and what lay behind his actions. After James's confession, the investigation proceeded to an important step: the reconstruction of events to understand exactly how events unfolded on that fateful day. This was not just a procedure, but a necessary element for the final consolidation of evidence and the formulation of charges that could be used in court. The investigative experiment was scheduled for May 16. James was brought to the scene where everything happened, he was to demonstrate exactly how he met Layla and led her to the warehouse. The time and place of this experiment were chosen to reproduce the setting as accurately as possible. James, under the watchful eye of the investigators, stood at the entrance to the very warehouse where his actions led to the tragedy. He pointed to the place where he met Layla and calmly recounted how he approached her. According to him, he saw her walking down the street. He offered to take her to the warehouse, promising to show her something interesting. It was a typical trick that Layla fell for, not suspecting danger. He claimed that her curiosity played a role, and she agreed to go with him. In this moment, there was everything that could explain why she followed him without resistance. This episode was an important link in the chain of events. It showed that the crime did not begin with violence, but with manipulation. When the investigator asked what happened next, James began to describe how events began to unfold inside the warehouse. He reported that when they were in the shadow of old things, he tried to hold her, but she began to scream. This moment became a turning point. Everything became clearer in his memories. James admitted that upon hearing her screams, he panicked. He didn't want anyone to hear and come to help, and then he began to act. In response to her screams, he tried to silence her. He stated that at that moment, he committed actions that led to her strangulation. It was not a planned murder, but an impulsive act caused by the fear of being caught. His voice trembled as he described it. He could not fully explain why he acted that way, but all his words indicated that it was done in a fit of fear and anxiety, uncontrolled by him at that moment. The investigators then asked James to explain what he did after Layla stopped showing signs of life. He gritted his teeth and began to describe his actions. He told how he found a large cardboard box in the corner of the warehouse, how he placed Layla in it, trying to hide the traces of his crime. It was a terrible realization of how cold-bloodedly he acted after committing the crime. But the strangest detail that remained after this was related to the symbol James drew on the box. The investigator asked him about the meaning of this drawing, but James was never able to explain why he did it. He claimed that he just took a marker and drew the symbol, not thinking about its meaning. This remained the last element of irrationality in his actions, an attempt to hide traces, but at the same time, leaving something that could not be understood, neither then nor later. The reconstruction of the incident confirmed all the facts that were already known to the investigation and provided new, even more gruesome details. James had now not only admitted his involvement, but also showed through his actions how easily a murder resulting from impulsive decisions could occur. The trial began on May 18, 2 months after James's arrest. The accusation was clear and well-founded: murder with aggravating circumstances. The prosecutor, presenting the case, focused on strong evidence. He began with a detailed description of key moments of the investigation that confirmed James's involvement. The video recording, showing him entering the warehouse with a large cardboard box, became the main argument of the prosecution. James's confession, his actions at the crime scene, and the results of examinations were also taken into account. All of this constituted an ironclad evidentiary base. The evidence collected by the investigation is absolutely exhaustive. We have a video recording where the accused himself is captured breaking the law, and his confession of guilt, the prosecutor stated. His speech was confident and restrained, as was the entire process. He understood that these facts left no room for doubt, and every moment in the process heightened the gravity of the accusations. After all the evidence was presented, the court moved to the defense. James's lawyer, as expected, began to build his defense on the psychological state of his client. He argued that James was in a psycho-emotional disorder, which could have affected his perception of reality at the time of the crime. Our client was not in a state to control his actions. He was in an affective state, the lawyer stated. He tried to mitigate the punishment based on a psychiatric examination that showed signs of mental disorder, but did not make him completely insane. However, this argument was not convincing enough for the court. The defense's arguments about a state of affect were rejected because the prosecution was able to prove that James acted consciously. The judge, having heard all sides, ruled that the accused's mental state did not relieve him of responsibility for his actions. On May 20, the judge announced the verdict. He found James guilty of murder with aggravating circumstances, rejecting the defense's arguments of insanity. The court ruled that, despite the mental disorder, the accused's actions were conscious and, therefore, he must be punished. The sentence was harsh. James was sentenced to 25 years in prison. This verdict brought closure to a case that had lasted several months, but brought justice, despite all attempts at justification. The view of James's fate became clear. He had to answer for his actions, and now his life was in the hands of the justice system. This verdict was the final point in the investigation. Now that everything was completed, the only thought remaining was that no crime, no matter how convoluted, could hide from justice. After the trial, Layla's family's life was forever changed. Her mother and older brother Max, despite the verdict, could not find peace in Edmonton. The city where they lost a loved one was no longer home to them. Within 1 year after the trial, they decided to sell their house and leave their hometown. Nothing remained of that place but pain and memories. It was a difficult but necessary decision. Layla would not return, and the grief of loss would be with them forever. Their departure became a symbol that wounds on the heart do not heal, and even after justice, people remain broken. This tragedy did not bypass the entire city either. Edmonton, quiet and peaceful, had always seemed protected from such terrible events. However, what happened to Layla shook everyone. The city authorities had no choice but to react. The city council decided to strengthen security measures in public places. Additional surveillance cameras were installed in playgrounds, parks, and other recreation areas, and patrolling was significantly increased. These measures were aimed at preventing such an incident from happening again. And although no one could bring back lost lives, the authorities tried to restore a sense of security to the city. However, despite all these changes and efforts to improve public safety, unresolved questions continue to trouble. How many more people like James are hiding among us? And how can we understand what symbol he drew on the box? Psychiatric studies showed signs of disorder, but an exact diagnosis was never made. What exactly drove him, why the symbol was drawn, and what role it played in this crime, these questions remained without final answers. The case was closed, James was convicted, and went to serve his sentence. But for many people, especially for his family, this was not a real end. Questions remained, and the reality of what happened continued to haunt those involved in this tragedy. And although justice was served, everyone was left with the question of what else might have been hidden in this story, and what led a person to such terrible acts.